was people began to use those 8 bits for squirreling away various data files.
Yeah.
And the first thing anyone realized, the software had already gone too far along for anyone to reclaim him, and that cost them hell to pay when they went to generalize the memory mapping of the 360 years later.
Let me mention one other remark there. Amdahl took the position that relocation was unnecessary, and he took this position. Certainly didn't take it at this time, but later he took it.
Yeah. Dynamic relocation or once and for all relocation?
Let me make my point. You may be right that I'm not adequately distinguishing between these two.
Yeah.
But anyway, he thought dynamic relocation was unnecessary, and he based this on the following idea: that he did a simulation of a stream of fast jobs and showed to his satisfaction that each job could be put in a fixed could be loaded for a fixed location in memory and could be left there. He took this batch from a Bell Labs Fortran batch job stream in order to convince himself of that. So what he didn't know about, for example, were editors or interactive programs in general.
Yeah, he had a very strong preconception of how the machine ought to be used.
Yeah. And now,
and he's a very smart fellow, but he just had a different viewpoint of how the machine was going to get used.
Let me make one remark. I missed a chance to confront Amdahl on these issues because about a month ago, the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry had an anniversary celebration, and there was to be a session on the computer of which I was to be a speaker and Amdahl was to be chairman. So I was all set to bring up this 21 years later, all of these old issues. I had my copy of the book ready and so forth and so on. But unfortunately, Amdahl got flu and didn't come.
Unfair. Gene's a good guy.
Yeah, let me come back to a point that, at least in my memory, what really appealed to me about timeshare, and that's why I got involved, otherwise I wouldn't have, was the notion of essentially the computer utility, of providing individual with computer resources as they needed, where they needed, and that, John, comes from your article.
Yeah.
That was definitely my own motivation, and at that point I became a salesman. You know, I remember in that period, in fall 62 and spring 63, just giving so darn many talks, selling that point. And it was hitting very well. And the analogy with other utilities. In a very real sense, this is what sold Project Mac afterwards too. It was just a notion that people didn't expect, and the implementation of the notion. That you could sit at a terminal and do your own work while there were a hell of a lot of other people working at the same time. And that you could share. For instance, as soon as mailboxes appeared, and it didn't take long, that was a great thing. The fact that you could arrange it so that you could look over the shoulders of somebody else when it was working. This is for educational purpose. That is, that you could, in fact, a student could ask his instructor to connect and see what he was doing so they could help him. All those things became very quickly very important.
You say as soon as what? When was that?
That was immediately as soon as CTSS went on the air. I'm talking about 64. It went on the air in October. I think that 6 months later, all this thing had really caught fire. I think.
Well, we had a lot of the ultimate functionality in CTSS, often kind of patched in. John's argument was we shouldn't have gone any further, and he might have been right in that regard. But I guess I'd like to pick up the theme of there was a whole set of consequences on the rest of the industry when we decided to go with GE. And in
I'd like to hear
IBM,
more about how IBM hit the roof.
that's in fact the key thing. IBM reacted very hard. First of all, they had a team of people trying to work with us in the Cambridge Scientific Center. So they proceeded to beef that up and even gave them a 360 Model 40, I think, to play with or something, which to re-engineer and try to do some time-sharing experimentation under Norm Rasmussen, who was a group leader. A couple of the key people that worked with us on CTSS went down, got lured away and went to work for them. Bob Creasy and, forget the other person's name.
Yeah. And they developed
Was it the guy who wrote
They developed
about user behavior?
No, that was another one.
Yeah.
Bayless, John Bayless. I forget the first name.
And
Bayless.
they developed what is
Dick
called
Bayless.
the Mac,
and they developed the Cambridge Scientific System.
Yeah.
Or no. What do they call it? Conversational Programming System on a Cambridge Monitor System.
Yeah.
CMS.
Cambridge Monitor.
CP-CMS was it?
CP-CMS.
CP divided by CMS.
And their notion was they took to heart the notion of the virtual machine, and their key idea was to try to multiplex a single large 360 into a lot of sub-360s, which every user could have, including executing their own bootload. In other words, it was actually a raw 360.
But that happened later.
But that was their key idea, and then they added on this a CTSS-like monitor, which called the Cambridge Monitor System, that was Cambridge Monitor System, what turned into a bunch of small 360s.
That was not Rochester's idea of the virtual machine. He did that, and then your programmers.
I thought it was from Creasy. Well, I don't know.
Creasy and the other then developed essentially. Bailey developed a time-sharing system very much like CTSS within that context.
Yeah. Now, this started out as being just a modest experiment to try out the ideas, and it didn't assume major importance until the other reaction, the main reaction of IBM, nearly fell on its face, namely that was the model first 66, later 67, which was an adaptation of the 65. And what they did was various groups that felt they wanted to stay with IBM and felt they would have a lot of leverage staying with IBM, like University of Michigan, Lincoln Laboratories, Carnegie Mellon, to name a few.
Stanford. Stanford.
Was Stanford part of the group too?
But look, we have to go
Stanford did order 67.
Okay, but there was an initial group of 5 or 6.
No, look, let's go historical here because there were several steps. The first step was we decided and informed the administration that we're going to get the GE equipment. Okay, that's when IBM first realized, and there were all sorts of problems and argument, and the provost, Charlie Towns, set up a review committee to review our decision, and there were lots of meetings, and eventually they approved our decision on technical ground. All right, so we started work. And this was August 64 when that conclusion was reached. And during the fall, we started interacting very strongly with the G people in the development of a fast run, in the development of the segmentation and paging hardware. Okay, then comes January. January, Ed David and his crew from Bell Laboratory come up to talk with us because they were interested in a new installation. They were quite intrigued by time sharing. And to make a long story short, Bell Laboratory decided to work with us. So the project became a two-organization project, Bell Laboratory and MIT, and we started working very intimately together. Soon thereafter, General Electric began to think that this was a big thing. You see, so they became part of the project. So it became a three-headed monster. and that's the way we work. Now, IBM did not react first, really, when Bell Laboratory joined us, and they were quite upset, but they didn't react, they didn't do anything. But when Lincoln Laboratory put out a request for proposal, with the specification essentially being the same as the Multic specification, they just plain copied it, expecting that only GE would respond to something like that. They were quite ready to join the effort with us. That was when, Corby? That must have been something like the summer '65 already, because Bell Laboratory was aboard. Then IBM reacted, and essentially the order went out, do whatever is necessary, but don't lose Lincoln Laboratory. And that's when the proposal for the 67 came out to be developed. The software be developed in collaboration with Lincoln, as I said, a big programming team at Lincoln, and the hardware, of course, was done at IBM, but still in collaboration with Lincoln. When it became official that they were developed this new machine called the 67, then a lot of people, other people, as Corby was saying, they were interested in remaining with IBM, joined in. The University of Michigan, I think, was the first one.
No, there was still an initial group of about 5 or 6 that were the ringleaders.
That's right.
They were the ones that were allowed the privilege of being on the advisory or mark
That's right.
or
But the
supervisory.
point that I wanted to make is that the project started with Lincoln, then other joined, but really was the Lincoln request for a proposal
may have triggered it, yes.
that triggered the whole thing.
Okay.
I don't know precisely when the other joined in, but it was the Lincoln.
And
Is IBM happy with you now?
no, well, we've made peace.
Sure.
But,
Yeah.
No, but they had a history.
I even have a daughter working for IBM.
No, but they've had a history. They really made a botch of that project because their reaction in hindsight was overreaction. Whereas at the peak of the Multics project, we had maybe 100 people on it involving all 3 organizations. They had, by our own estimates and from what they told us, in the order of 1,000 people working on it. So they had roughly 10 times the people. They did it on a faster timetable, as you would expect them to try to do. And they rushed out a system which was just cobbled together and was abysmal in performance. And
that was another one that they got from you.
Thanks.
Somebody quoted you as having said that what really counted in terms of user satisfaction was uniformity of response time.
Oh,
Uniformly
They actually put something into their system that would make it never respond quickly.
well, that certainly misunderstood what I meant.
Ducto to absurdum, never respond.
Yeah, right. But they had terrible. Well, let's to pull it back to the main thread. That system was a terrible disappointment, and within about 6 months of the first releases, this is now 68, 69, thereabouts, they were in desperate straits trying to keep the customers who had ordered the 67 hardware, actually had it on site, and were wondering what to do with it, whether to turn it in or scrap it or start running it in the 65 compatibility mode, which would have been a moral defeat at the least. And at that point, people discovered this Cambridge monitor system, which would run the conversational programming version of CTSS-like system. And people glommed onto that. Lincoln led the way, as I recall. They glommed on that, and they saved face. In effect, people didn't have to turn in the hardware. They had a kind of a time-sharing system that was so-so. It hasn't changed very much. It's now the VM system you must have used recently. It's really pretty crude, and yet it was better than nothing. And so that's the way they left it, and it survived to this day inside IBM.
But it's used by not merely survived.